How Can Parapsychology Be Christian? A lecture given by Dr. Roger Straughan at the CFPSS annual conference held in Exeter in September 2011.
Now you may have noticed that this question I'm using as the title for this paper, How Can Parapsychology Be Christian? That can be asked in two different ways. It can be asked in a way that implies a sort of scornful disbelief, scepticism. How can parapsychology be Christian? What a ridiculous idea. Of course it can't. Or it can be asked in a more neutral, constructive sort of way, which assumes that the idea is feasible and is just inquiring how it might be implemented. Now, I want to look at both forms of the question today, but you might well feel, with some justification, that I'm being a bit presumptuous here in thinking that I can say anything new about this subject at a conference like this. Well, I'm certainly very conscious that many distinguished figures, both within the Church's fellowship and outside it, have examined this question far more thoroughly than I can possibly hope to do in the time I've got today. And I'll be relying on a lot of their work very heavily. But in the study of any subject, I think, it's always useful from time to time to stand back a bit, to ask a few critical questions about the precise nature and status of that subject. What's it actually about? Does it hang together? And that's particularly important when we are considering something as controversial and as speculative as Christian parapsychology. So although I'm certainly not claiming to say anything wildly original today, I do want to look at some possible lines of approach to the subject from a slightly different angle. And that may, I hope, provide and provoke some further debate and even hopefully some disagreement, because I may be a bit provocative here and there. Incidentally, I've listed the main sources I'll be referring to on this sheet here, so you don't have to scribble down details of names, etc. as I'm speaking, so do collect one of those at the end if you want one. Right, let's start with that first way of asking my question. How can parapsychology be Christian? Now, rather surprisingly you might think, I have got quite a lot of sympathy with what that question implies. Can parapsychology really qualify as a meaningful area of study? Well, to start on a provocative note, I'm going to suggest that Christian parapsychology isn't really a subject as such at all. Why not? Well, we don't usually put that adjective Christian in front of an academic subject like that. We don't speak about Christian chemistry, Christian economics, Christian sociology. So why Christian parapsychology? Of course, Christians can be parapsychologists. I have to say that because we have the editor of the Christian Parapsychologist sitting here. But they can also be chemists, they can be economists, they can be sociologists, they can be anything. But that doesn't create subjects with those titles. Any academic subject like chemistry, economics, parapsychology, it's going to have its own procedures, its own methods, its own language, and it's all of that that allows us to test claims and theories within that subject. So the religious beliefs, or lack of them in fact, that may be held or not held by a chemist or an economist or a parapsychologist, they are strictly irrelevant, I'm suggesting, to whether or not that person's work and ideas are sound and worthy of attention within the subject. You can only judge that by the procedures of the subject itself. And you can't use religious criteria to make those judgments. If you did, it would be a bit like mixing up the rules of two different games. It would be like asking the umpire at a cricket match to make a decision by using the rules of baseball. You just can't do it. It doesn't make sense. And of course we've seen what can happen from trying to mix up religious and scientific criteria in the case of the Church's reaction to Galileo and more recently to Darwin. So we can't mix up the rules of two different subject areas, I'm saying. A Buddhist can be a mathematician and a Christian can be a parapsychologist. But that doesn't create a subject of Buddhist mathematics any more than it creates a subject of Christian parapsychology. Now, that means that if we're going to accept parapsychology as a valid subject for study, which I think we should, a subject with its own methods of collecting and analysing data, testing theories, and so on, we need to recognise that putting that word Christian in front doesn't allow us to overrule those methods or to reject certain data and theories. For example, we can't dismiss out of hand all the data on, say, near-death experiences, which we've heard a lot about already, just because it may conflict with some Christian beliefs. The evidence has got to be tested against parapsychological criteria, not theological ones. But I think there's another reason, this is where perhaps I get a bit more controversial, why Christian parapsychology can't be interpreted as an independent subject in its own right, a subject which tries to apply Christian criteria to parapsychology, a subject which only accepts those areas of parapsychology which are acceptable to Christian beliefs. But the problem is, I think, what would these Christian criteria be? What would these Christian beliefs actually be? What would the yardstick be? How, in other words, do we actually define that word Christian? Now, I think it's easy to be a bit complacent here, actually, and assume there's no real problem. Surely we all know what Christian means, don't we? Well, do we? What we should all know, I think, is that the history of Christianity has been marked throughout by violent controversy, disagreement, conflict of all kinds, some of it very violent kind. And we also know that this has resulted in a huge diversity of beliefs, of practices, of denominations, and a bewildering array of doctrines, dogmas, creeds, confessions, and so on. So, what Christian yardstick could possibly be consistent with all of that? How could we get agreement over what would count as the Christian view of parapsychology from, let's say, an evangelical fundamentalist, a liberal radical theologian, a Catholic, a Quaker, a Christian spiritualist, a Christian scientist, and so on? Yet all of those people would no doubt quite rightly object if they were denied the title of Christian. And of course we don't have to go to the extreme edges of the Christian spectrum to find radical disagreements over many fundamental beliefs, doctrines and practices. Many surveys have shown widespread differences of belief, both within and between a variety of Christian churches and denominations on key central issues such as the resurrection, salvation, the virgin birth, the Trinity, original sin, the devil, we heard quite a bit about already, the second coming, and perhaps most importantly for our purposes, life after death. So I'm suggesting that the definition of Christian and non-Christian has got to be controversial, highly controversial. And this wide diversity of Christian beliefs has got to raise pretty big problems for anything we want to try and label neatly as Christian parapsychology. And in fact, from some Christian perspectives, Christian parapsychology is even a contradiction in terms. It's something to be avoided at all lengths and kept at arm's length, because everything paranormal, everything psychical is thought to lie firmly within the province of the devil. Okay, now please don't get up and run off at this point and go and see Julian and demand your money back from the conference organizer, because you've just been told that the whole idea of Christian parapsychology doesn't make sense. You won't get your money back at this stage anyway, so I wouldn't even try. But so far I may have sounded a bit negative, but I now want to turn positive, you'll be glad to hear, and suggest that there are other ways, perhaps, of interpreting Christian parapsychology which may be much more fruitful. For the reasons I've just tried to give, I don't think that Christian parapsychology can refer to an identifiable subject in its own right. But what it can refer to, and what I think it should refer to, is a process that explores the relationship between two different sets of data. And I'm going to use the word data quite a bit from now on. It looks at where these sets of data are consistent with each other, where they disagree, how one can illuminate the other. Now, some Christians, I'm sure, might be a bit unhappy about having their religious beliefs and experiences and traditions referred to by that rather cold-sounding word, data. But what does data really mean? Well, you don't have to be a classicist to know that it simply means what has been given. And if we keep that in mind, surely most Christians wouldn't object to the idea that all aspects of their Christian understanding have been, in some sense, given. So I'm using data in that sense. But of course, data doesn't equal proof. Data simply can be used as evidence of various kinds, evidence that can be weighed and interpreted. And that's certainly the case both with parapsychological and with Christian data. Now, if Christian parapsychology is concerned with this relationship between Christian and parapsychological data, we've got to ask two key questions. Firstly, what parapsychological data are most relevant to Christian belief? And then, turning it around the other way, what Christian data are most relevant to the study of parapsychology? And I want to spend the rest of my time really looking at those two questions. First then, what parapsychological data are most relevant to Christian belief? Well, I think you could reasonably argue that all parapsychological data are relevant if they're concerned with exploring that largely unknown range of human faculties and the largely unknown nature of human consciousness. Because surely the question, what does it mean to be human, that lies at the heart of Christian belief. That's okay, but in the limited time I've got to sharpen the focus quite a bit, and so I'm going to concentrate just on a few central issues where Christianity and parapsychology seem most clearly to overlap. And probably the most obvious example that comes to mind here is that whole question of the possible survival of individuality after physical death. That was the question, as we've heard a bit earlier on, which gave the Society for Psychical Research its initial impetus well over 100 years ago. And survival research, as it's now known, remains a major area of parapsychology today. Now, of course, you'll all know that a vast amount of relevant data has accumulated over that period, and it comes from a lot of different sources, including studies of apparitions, mediumship, near-death experiences, possession, reincarnation, and so on. Now, this certainly isn't the place for me to go into any of that mountain of data in any detail, but I must just mention the man we honoured yesterday, David Fontana, who was a very great man in my view, and his book, Is There an Afterlife, for anyone who hasn't read it, is a masterly summary and overview of both the historical and the modern evidence on this subject. So if you haven't read it, you ought to. But how might all this material relate to the questions I've been raising about Christian parapsychology? Well, it follows from what I've said that this data can't be accepted or rejected just on religious or theological grounds. Take another example. Professor Ian Stevenson's lifetime work on cases suggestive of reincarnation. That can't just be rejected or ignored because reincarnation may not be consistent with some Christian beliefs, although there have always been Christians actually who accept it. But the evidence has to be judged on its parapsychological merits, not on theological grounds. And the same applies, I think, to the picture of the afterlife that emerges from apparent post-mortem communications. And we're certainly not lacking in evidence here. There's almost too much of it to cope with. And I suppose if one has to pick out a typical example here, one might go to the detailed analytic work of Dr. Robert Crookall, which many of you will be familiar with. Crookall drew upon an extensive body of data from a wide range of varied sources, and by doing that he was able to build up a consistent, coherent picture of what we can reasonably expect to happen when we die. And like the good professional scientist that he wasn't any weird dropout character. He was, I think, the government advisor on fossil fuels for a large part of his life. He was a good professional, hard-nosed scientist. He developed provisional models and hypotheses from his data, just what any good scientist does. And this work has to be judged again on its parapsychological merits, not rejected out of hand if it doesn't always conform to standard Christian belief. But in fact, I think it's impossible, really, to identify what might count as the standard Christian view of the afterlife. And here, perhaps again, I'm going to be a little bit controversial, because we're back again to defining that problem of deciding the word Christian. Now, the difficulties involved in trying to sort out any clear Christian view of the afterlife, I think they're very well summarised by a leading figure in the earlier days of the Church's Fellowship, the Reverend Alan Barham. And writing about the Christian view of the afterlife, he starts off by criticising, not difficult to do, the stark traditional Christian view of hell. But then he goes on as follows: but the general conception of heaven isn't an altogether attractive one either. Some visualise it as a kind of unending church service. And even those with a love of music would hardly welcome such a prospect. Moreover, entry into heaven, it's sometimes taught, is to be preceded by the sleep of death, which may well last for an immense period of time. On the other hand, it's also taught that the moment after death we shall be in the full presence of Christ, for which most people would feel rather ill-prepared. As a consequence, says Barham, among Christians there's often the feeling that the conventional idea of heaven is almost as unreal as the conventional idea of hell. It's not surprising, he says, that public opinion polls show very great numbers of those who call themselves Christians have no belief at all in a continuance of life in another state when they die. And those sentiments were echoed by another favourite of mine, the great Rayner Johnson. If anybody hasn't come across Rayner Johnson yet, you have a great treat in store for you. Look him up. Rayner Johnson also doubted whether the average Christian held any clear views of the next life. He wrote, "I suspect that the average Christian believes that after death we become formless spirits floating about in an indescribable heaven or temporarily accommodated in purgatory. If so, I can understand the source of funereal gloom." Rather nice, that. Now, the historical roots of this confusion, I think we have to admit that there is radical confusion here, and the historical roots are discussed in detail by John Hick, who Marianne referred to last night. John Hick's monumental work, Death and Eternal Life. And there he contrasts the early Christian understanding of death and the afterlife in terms of the departed being received and accepted by God, with the theology of Augustine, whose, I quote, dark themes of guilt, remorse and punishment, heaven and hell, have dominated the Christian imagination in the West, unquote. Then again, in contrast with the Augustinian view, that one, we've got Bunyan's picture of life as a pilgrimage, with bodily death marking the passing from one stage to another of that pilgrimage. And if we want even more evidence of these incompatible sets of Christian belief, we've only got to look at the heated conflict which has surrounded the whole issue of praying for the dead. And on a lighter note, if you're interested in that, there's a wonderful Lord Peter Wimsey short detective story on just that subject. The whole plot turns on the conflict about whether we should pray for the dead or not. Very good. So, not to put too fine a point on it, Christian teaching about the afterlife, I suggest, is a pretty confused mess. And that is no doubt one reason why, a main reason, why many clergy seem so embarrassed about the subject. Why many Christians have no firm belief in an afterlife, and possibly also why traditional Christianity has lost its appeal for many people today. And it's worth remembering, perhaps, that the founder of the Church's Fellowship, Reginald Lester, he described how he found the Church completely unable to supply the guidance and comfort he needed when he lost his faith after his first wife's death. And that was how the Church's Fellowship began. So, given this wide array of incompatible beliefs about death and the afterlife, all of which are going to claim that they are Christian, can parapsychology offer anything to try and resolve some of these issues? Well, I think it certainly can. If we look at the extensive data on apparent post-mortem communications and on near-death experiences, for example, what do we find? Well, we find no support whatever for the idea of a comatose state of hibernation lasting for ages until a final decisive day of judgment. Nor is there any hint there of a once and for all external judgment process at death, dependent on our religious beliefs. A judgment that results in our immediate transfer to a glorious heaven or a horrific hell. In fact, the data are much more in line with Bunyan's picture, I think, of a journey or a pilgrimage, which allows our spiritual development to continue after death. And the main obstacle to that development seems to have nothing to do with holding the wrong doctrinal beliefs. It's much more to do with being restricted by any form of inflexible dogmatism or attachment, including religious dogmatism. We've got Paul Beard's careful analysis, for example, of a wide range of apparent communications, and that provides powerful support for this developmental picture. It suggests a gradual progress through a number of stages, a number of levels of consciousness, which allow different and appropriate forms of learning to take place. And surely that shouldn't surprise any Christian in view of Jesus' illuminating reference, already mentioned earlier in this conference, to what's usually translated as many mansions. The better translation probably, this is slightly disputed, but the better translation is probably many stopping places. And the analogy has been drawn with motorway service stations. Well, it doesn't sound quite so good as mansions, but so the data suggests that there are new experiences to be had, new lessons to be learned, and that's a very different prospect from the traditional Christian one of resting in peace, which we see so evidently on gravestones. Then again, the fast-growing body of evidence on near-death experiences is also at variance in some respects with many traditional Christian beliefs. The being of light, for example, common feature of the experiences, it's interpreted in terms of cultural expectations, not usually directly identified with Christ. And again, there's no irreversible external judgment coming up here, although some form of provisional self-judgment is often mentioned. There is the common feature of the experience of being greeted by loved ones who've previously died, and that's supported, as we heard from Sue Brain, and I'm sure we'll hear from Peter Fenwick tonight, by the extensive data on deathbed visions. But these welcoming individuals, whom it seems we're very likely to meet, they don't seem to need any qualifications of holding particular religious beliefs. They do their welcoming because they have some rapport and bonds of affection with us. And consequently, some Christian writers have even suggested that near-death experiences are the work of the devil, designed to lull us into a sense of false security. Well, maybe. Everyone's entitled to their own beliefs as long as they don't try and massacre other people who don't hold the same ones as themselves. But I would prefer to suggest that the sort of parapsychological data I've just been sketching here can help to clarify and illuminate some issues where the absence of any clear Christian consensus does appear confusing and off-putting both to Christians and non-Christians. Surely where there are these conflicting sets of belief, the parapsychological evidence should be taken into account in trying to reach a rational judgment. And parapsychology can, in this way, contribute a lot, I think, to Christian understanding. It can be a powerful ally. It should be a welcome ally in the fight against materialism. But sadly, it seems that many clergy haven't moved far from the extraordinary views expressed by the eminent Archbishop William Temple in his Gifford lecture, where he claimed that sound evidence for man's survival of death was, quote, positively undesirable, unquote, because it would, quote, make very much harder the essential business of faith, unquote. No comment. But what about the reverse situation? What can Christianity contribute to parapsychology? And I'll have to be quick here. But there's a great deal of data here. The Bible is chock full, Old and New Testament, chock full of apparently paranormal events. And many writers have explored this psychical dimension of the Bible, following the shining example of the Fellowship's first General Secretary, the Reverend Maurice Elliott. The main theme of much of this work is that most of the paranormal events described in the Bible have close parallels in the data of modern psychical research. They shouldn't be seen as unique occasions of divine intervention. More recently than Maurice Elliott, for example, Bishop Hugh Montefiore, in his last book, and it's on the bookstall out there, The Miracles of Jesus, published in 2005, he argued that the so-called gospel miracles fall into a category of phenomena not only found in the Gospels, but also in modern secular sources of paranormal events. But the Christian contribution isn't just limited to biblical sources. Trevor mentioned that recently published book, massive tome, 800 pages of it, Irreducible Mind. I think it's going to be a classic text both in psychology and parapsychology. And that book has lengthy sections on Christian mystical experience, Christian healing, prayer, and the appearance of stigmata, which we heard about earlier. And these form a more comprehensive survey of various phenomena which challenge the identification of brain and mind. So Christian data, I think, has a very important role here, but we shouldn't ever assume that Christianity has a monopoly here. Other religious traditions also offer similar examples. So, to wrap this up, Christian and parapsychological data can interact at many points, and they can illuminate each other, I think. But rather than give more examples, which I haven't got time to do, I want to finish by emphasizing the provisional nature of our understanding in both these areas. I said already that data doesn't equal proof. Dogmatism is the only unpardonable sin here as elsewhere. And I'd like to underline this by ending with the words of a man whose picture you've already seen this afternoon. A man who could certainly be called a Christian parapsychologist. That's not all he was. He also found time to be a philosopher and a poet and, incidentally, Prime Minister, Lord Arthur Balfour. And he wrote these words, which Rayner Johnson claimed should be inscribed over every church and temple, the entrance to every church and temple. Lord Arthur Balfour. Our highest truths are but half-truths. Think not to settle down forever in any truth. Make use of it as a tent in which to spend a summer's night, but build no house of it, or it will be your tomb. Well, we don't get that sort of thing from prime ministers today, do we? Well, I've only had half an hour to tackle this question, so you can only expect half-truths from me at the most. But if we can continue to foster this kind of interaction between Christian and parapsychological data that I've tried to sketch out, perhaps we might be able to move just a bit nearer to some three-quarter truths. Thank you.